Hello, everybody, and welcome again to this webinar series where we will be trying to explain some of the main principles that flow through our medical device regulatory scheme, both here in the UK and in Europe. In this particular webinar, we'll be talking about risk management and risk assessments. And risk is one of those principles which actually flows through our entire regulatory process. So it will actually come up in a number of the other webinars which you're probably looking to download and listen to. But it's really exciting for me to invite James Pink to our discussions here to talk about risk particularly. James is a senior director at Element, but has over 25 years of experience in the medical devices industry, including 10 years as a health technology expert and lead auditor for a leading European notified body. James began his career as a product designer in the oil tools industry, moving into medical physics and clinical engineering at the Royal Hallamshire Hospital in Sheffield. But his industrial experience includes managing both product development and quality assurance programs for both active and non-active medical technologies, as well as technologies around combination products. James is a contributor to several medical device committees and programs, including those at ISO level, international standard organization levels, for things like quality management and risk management, as well as looking into a number of product-related standards as well. Welcome, James. Welcome, and thank you for sparing your time with us here in this particular webinar to talk about the really important topic of risk management. So, James, welcome to this particular webinar. It's great to have you with us. I know that you've done a lot of work in the past on working on global standards around risk management as well as quality management. So I think it's a really good time, a really good juncture and a really good opportunity to have you with us to talk about risk management, particularly as it relates to like a living process with medical technologies and product development. Is risk is one of those things, as we've said before in other webinars, that you shouldn't let the ink dry on them, right? How does that sort of when should we be strategizing for risk? When should we start to think about risk, and how should it be updated? How does 14971 work? This is a huge question.
Thanks for having me, Phil. I think the realities are, well, a little bit of background. I've been involved in sort of risk management in medical technology since what we called EN 1441, in sort of prior to the turn of the millennia. So I was involved in the sort of drafting for nearly 25 years now. You can't tell, of course, but you know, I don't think anything's really changed with risk management in product safety. You know, we always want a safe and effective device, and you know, we have always wanted to ensure that whether it's a medicinal implant, or whether it's an infusion pump or a wound dressing, or it's an X-ray machine, we've always wanted to ensure that devices have been designed, manufactured and installed and serviced or implanted and supported, or whatever we want post-market, with a very, very clear knowledge that the known risks that exist for those type of devices, intended purposes and technologies are being managed in a way that the benefit risk ratio is in the right in the right balance. And to be honest, since we had the product liability directives, you know, in the late 90s, and since we brought the new approach directives out in 1990, 1993, we've always sought to ensure that not only do we have this really positive benefit risk ratio, but we also have what we call a high level of protection in accordance with the state of the art. And I think what's beginning to change in terms of product safety people who work in, you know, human health, public health, those medical device manufacturers, you know, we all go in there to make a huge difference. And I think one of the big the biggest changes with this sort of keeping the ink wet, if you wish, if you want to take that analogy, is that it's becoming more and more lucid about how you actually design a system to do that. And you can't have these static sort of events where, back in 1994, the inventor realized all of the reasons why this design works and does not work, and then has designed the device to, achieve a particular purpose and reduce a particular risk. But then fast forward another 30 years and we've got the age of, the internet, we've got all these new found knowledge about what can kill us and how it can kill us, and carcinogens and phthalates and, problems around, removing machine oil from orthopedic implants, and all these bumps and bruises and knowledge that we've got around risks and what are risks and how are risks controlled needs to have a system around it, a system that helps us intuitively design out risk by knowing what are the main things based upon our intended use and device characteristics, the things that help us make a device to specification by controlling risks in manufacture, transportation, installation, so on and so forth, and having a very, very sensitive system that is, a very strong, powerful radar that is ultimately looking for a signal that says, whoa, hold on a minute, there might be something wrong with this technology, there might be something wrong with, the device itself. And that requires systems, it requires interactions of systems, it requires a very sort of methodological, systematic approach to managing. And risk management is relatively simple in the medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation, because you get this massive indication of what you've got to do by looking at Annex 1 in the regulations. You will read in Annex 1 that you have to, provide a device that's safe and effective, that when you balance out the risks versus the benefits, you've got a device that, is safe, is effective, and has been made so in accordance with a high level of protection in the state of the art. You then get even more indication when you start to step through which GSPRs are applicable, because as you move into the second chapter of the GSPRs in Annex 2, so, as you're reading this or listening to this webinar now, have a look in the MDR or the IVDR Annex 1, go to Chapter 2, and just step through a few of the requirements, and you'll hear it say something like, devices shall be designed and manufactured to reduce the risk of. And now you've got a bit of there's a clue there that you've now got something to manage. And now you've identified that characteristic is applicable to your device, maybe through the intended purpose because it's implantable, maybe because it's technological characteristics because it's electrically powered. Now you've done that, that lives with you. That's your responsibility as a manufacturer to make sure you've designed out that risk or eliminated or reduced as far as possible, and that you're carrying that risk through your quality management system, through your device specification, your supply chain, and that you are not letting go of that risk until you've heard back from the market that risk is working, the control you've selected is actually working. And in addition to that sort of string of GSPR going around from manufacturer to post-market coming back, and then, oh, are we okay? Are we not okay? Is the decision-making processes around, have we got a change in the benefit risk? Sometimes the benefit changes. We've seen that with a number of implants over the years where simply the state of the art in the medicine is to opt for a different therapeutic alternative or diagnostic alternative. And as a result, the state of the art and the benefit risk changes because there may be more inherently safe devices. And as a result, you have to work even harder. So I think the concept of risk management has always been there. I don't think a lot has changed at all in terms of the behaviors or the way competent authorities have thought about risk with devices, the way that they've regulated devices. I don't think there's been a lot of change there at all. What I do think is that we've become much more cognizant through using ISO 14971, through the new requirements in the European regulations, talking about how the system of risk works with technical documentation, how it works and interacts with your clinical evaluation, how it actually is used in the design and the verification, validation of your device so that you can confirm those risks of control. I think that that's become much more explicit.
And if I remember back to our discussions on conformity assessment, that's one of the areas where the notified bodies find most troublesome or find more non-conformities, if you like, is the way that you join up all of those sorts of systems across risk.
Yeah, it's if ever you get 3 or 4 notified body and anyone who's a public health official in medical technologies, get them in a room. I think we've been in a room once before, Phil, if you remember, with the MHRA and a few others, and you get these people together and you can play a game. You can say wound dressing, and immediately there's a thought that's going through people's minds now. And what we're doing in our minds is we're looking at okay, what is a wound dressing intended for? What is its device characteristics? It has to be sterile. It has to actually take, exudate. It has to be in contact with the skin. And immediately you've got this sense of, right, the manufacturer needs to be doing biocompatibility, sterilization validation, material qualification, and we need to know that the exudate can be managed. And already there are 4 hazardous situations that would carry through to the manufacturing, the design specification, and then what you're looking for post-market. And I think that, just to try and answer the questions about the notified bodies, that carries through with the notified bodies. And manufacturers often fail to realize that there are clear characteristics relating to your device that then the notified body has to demonstrate they've scrutinized you over. And they have to understand that you have achieved this high level of protection on, and that you have applied the state of the art, and that your risk controls have considered all available options to reduce as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. And many manufacturers fail to do that. It's more about, well, let's put a 14971 in, let's do loads of procedures. I've got a risk management plan. I've got all these lovely, what they call them, FMEAs and spreadsheets and lots of numbers, and you go dizzy with all the, greens and yellows and reds and stuff like that. And we think it's more of an engineering solution. A mathematician or an engineer gets involved in the risk management, and before you know it, we've got so many, this times that equals this. And we've turned it into reliability engineering as opposed to risk management for patient safety, and manufacturers have to understand the importance of those triggers that come from your classification and your intended purpose and your device characteristics that will carry on all the way through to your quality management system, to the records that the notified body auditor will select when they're reviewing your feedback. They will not be looking at, I'll just take anything. They'll be thinking, I've got a sterile medical device that's in contact with a human that's supposed to be taking this exudate up. I'm going to be looking to see if there's any problems about the way that wound dressing gets applied, any feedback around sensitization, irritation, anything that sort of suggests that there might be something wrong with the sterilization process, someone complaining that there's a foreign object in the packaging, or that it was too hard to open the pack, or it was too easy to open the pack. They're looking for those triggers because inherently they know what the characteristics are that affect safety, and that carries all the way through the risk management system. And they're looking to see that you are designing out those risks, that the manufacturing specification and the critical to quality attributes that you have to monitor in manufacturing supply chain. And as we said, in the post-market surveillance system, you are looking for triggers and events to suggest whether or not that benefit risk ratio is changing, or the risk controls you put in place are not working.
So you mentioned, I think, then that your risk can be used to design out some of those problem areas. So when should you start working on risk? As you actually have your drawing on a napkin, or maybe halfway through your development process? Certainly not at the end, right?
What a great question. When should you start your risk? I think what you should start doing is curating information that informs decisions about what you know is what they call known or foreseeable risks. Or sorry, known foreseeable hazards. They don't say risks. So risks is a combination of severity and occurrence of that. It's the hazard and the hazardous situation. So, for example, if you've got a pen and paper and you're drafting something out, let's say you're doing something around mechanical handling, or you're thinking about fluid flow, maybe in a cardiovascular device. If you're doing that, and you're going to be incredibly intelligent, and you're going to know exactly what the need is, already you could begin to think about, well, what are the hazards and hazardous situations here? As you move it from that sort of piece of paper into a prototype, things you're going to discover things. You might discover that as you alter the wall thickness, your turbidity increases. You might realize that if you change a material, you get a different flexural sort of properties, or you get different tensile properties, or you may, as you're running sort of simulations with, let's say, blood or with serum or whatever, you might notice different wear patterns already. And what you're doing there is archiving known and foreseeable hazards. And you're also getting a knowledge about your boundary conditions of the design solution as well at that stage, and why you're selecting materials, why you're selecting geometries, why you're selecting manufacturing processes, to get some level of reliability, reproducibility, and of course, at the very end, to make sure you've got the performance, function, safety, user requirements that you want to achieve. So I would suggest you start thinking about hazards and harms immediately at the beginning of your concepts and your proof of concepts and proof of principles. It will help you, because once you've done all your material selection, for example, for an implantable product, you've done your prototype and you've had this in models, maybe simulations or cadaveric or animal or whatever the models are, you've done that, and all that effort to do it, and then all of a sudden you forgot that it's an animal tissue you've used, or it contains a CMR substance, that could completely terminate your ability to get into the European market or the US market. So you really have to think about the essential requirements very early, the GSPRs, as we call them, and make sure that you've already thought about material selection, because that could be an important factor. Biocompatibility, that could be an important factor. If you're using nanoparticles, that could be an important factor. If you're using software that's got an AI algorithm, that could be an important factor. So I think the answer, although really long-winded as usual from me, it is yes, start thinking, but you don't have to be doing a full 14971 risk management plan, risk analysis, evaluation, controls as far as possible, risk verification, post-production information. No, recognize where you are in the pathway. We call them technology readiness levels nowadays, don't right. we? And as you're developing your product and moving from TRL1 through to TRL4, I'd expect you to now have a really good knowledge about why you've got what you've got, what are the known and foreseeable hazards and harms. As this has probably not gone first in human at that stage, or it's not got any sort of human-based data, we've got to do some simulations and sort of find out what those harms could be. And then as you move through into more sort of first in human, or if this is a predicate device, you start to know that you are meeting and addressing the standards that are available. You can then start to really refine your risk management and let that now get you into the design control process, where you can start to eliminate or reduce as far as possible and move into risk controls that are expected in 14971 in the European MDR Annex 1, Section 4.
So in the first instance then, consideration of risk is a tool really for developing your product. But as you move through that process and your product becomes more mature, what sort of triggers should you be looking for to revisit that risk management process?
Well, certainly The triggers are going to be the general safety and performance requirements, because you're going to sit there and think, right, are these applicable or not? Have I got a powered device? Yes, I have. If that's the case, you've got risks. You've got risks relating to interoperability. You've got risks related to electrical safety. You've got risks relating to electromagnetic compatibility, radio frequencies, cyber attacks, all that type of stuff. You've got certain risks that are now coming in. And therefore, those triggers should be sort of saying, you've got to get serious with how you're going to do your controls. You've got to be clear on what the state of the art is that will give you a sense that control is, a high level of protection, that it's in accordance with that state of the art. And you've got to get serious in terms of, ensuring that you are verifying that risk control is working, through testing, design verification, through obviously, once we're in the market, through the post-production, post-market surveillance plans that you have. But yeah, I think that would be the starting point for me, Phil.
Right. I'm guessing that as your product changes as well, as it gets older in its use, or maybe as it sort of, would you do risk assessments with less frequency, or would you sort of, I'm thinking maybe here that your risk management updates shouldn't necessarily be constrained by time points. They should be constrained by changes in the way that your product's being used or what it contains, right?
Yeah, you've got there are various sort of configuration items to consider. You've got the external environment. So the external environment is something you can't control. That could be anything from the operating environment of your equipment. It might be the reasonably foreseeable misuse, or the changes of indication, or the creepage of using your device for certain different things. The clinical state of the art could change. So again, that might have an impact on your benefit risk determinations. There's the internal environment that you can control, the obvious things that you don't want to experience, but you might have a supply chain shortage. We've just seen that with sterilization suppliers, where it's been difficult, and we've had to put some sort of resilience into the sterilization process parameters. We've seen that with packaging systems before, where there's been a shortage of materials. These may force you to make changes within your supply chain, or within your device itself, within the materials in there. So in those situations, you are now going to have to evaluate, do your risk management plan for that particular life cycle, which is the design change. You're going to have to look at what sources of information, how you're going to look at the characteristics that affect safety, and how you're going to now think about the GSPRs that may be impacted by that change, to determine whether or not the controls are going to be suitable. It's a whole new, ball game. The other internal factor is the changes you want to make. And in fact, your PMS in Article 83 in the medical device regulation demands that you think about, should I be changing the design? Should I be making this easier to use? Should I be, updating the instructions for use? Should I be modifying the intended purpose? These are decisions that you have to make. So you may be changing the device. And again, at that situation, we go back, we think about what are the characteristics before, what are the characteristics after, what are the known and foreseeable risks, hazards, should I say, and then what are the risks that we now have to evaluate, estimate, control, and verify as a result of it. So yeah, you've got those configuration items. And then you've also got what we've seen in terms of many devices over the years. We've got a knowledge that the tolerance of the medical clinical community to those devices and the benefit risk ratio has diminished. That things become unacceptable. It could be anything from a higher number of revision rates of an implant. It could be that there is unacceptable side effects or unacceptable harms that were previously accepted and experienced. It could be that for an IVD, that the diagnostic sensitivity and specificity was acceptable under let's say a screening program, But now this is now going to be moved into monitoring, or even as part of a confirmatory assay, and that sensitivity and specificity is no longer acceptable. So you might have to initiate changes, you might have to go back to your risk analyses and begin to update, oh, the benefit risk's changed. Do I have to now do something about withdrawing this product, or, informing the market, reducing my claims, and so on and so forth.
You mentioned it a couple of times, I think, just now, is this concept of benefit risk, and how that is influenced by changes of your product or changes in product maturity. But it's always been one of those concepts which I've found difficult to sort of try and picture as to how that can be determined. Who would determine what a positive benefit risk equation would look like? And I mean, do you need medical input into that? Is it just intuition, or is it just, again, one of those subjective measures which you just have to make a judgment on?
Great question. The regulatory framework in Europe now enables that sort of benefit risk ratio to be defined through expert panels and through what we call common specification. So there is an enabling activity where, for certain device groups, you may find that it is explicit in terms of what the clinical benefits need to be in sort of very quantifiable, clinical outcome driven sort of language, versus what the risks are and what are acceptable and what are intolerable. So look at surgical meshes, look at breast implants, look at orthopedic hip joint replacements. You've got very, very clear, lucid sort of indications of what is a clinical benefit over a risk profile. As you move through the other 699,992 product groups, there may be, something where it's not as well defined. You might be talking about something that's a minimal risk, middle risk, not an implantable, not got all these wonderful energies that can do all sorts of things to us if not controlled, and not so novel that we're a bit worried because it doesn't look or feel or smell right. It's just run of the mill sort of products that have got some alternatives that are quite similar, that have been well used, well established in the past, and now you're facing, well, how do I demonstrate clinical benefit over risk? And I'm afraid that does require a certain degree of clinical input, and one very important feature to begin with, as early as possibly can, is a clinical evaluation, where you look at the intended purpose. You want to be talking about the intended populations. You want to be saying whether it's therapeutic or diagnostic. You need to be explaining what that sort of, what is the positive impact of this device to health, there's a lot. We don't want these to be generic statements. Too often we're seeing in risk management, I've audited probably over 5,000 risk management documents in my lifetime. And you sort of look at that, and most of them are like weasel word statements. The benefit outweighs the risk because I said so, and that is like, really, what we need is to say, what did you go out to market with? How did you get somebody to purchase this device? Was it the turnaround time? Was it that you are going to be able to screen more than 100,000 patients rather than 10? What's the positive impact you're going to have? Is it outcomes driven? Is it that you heal faster, better? Is it that you can walk better? Is it that you restore more gait? Is it more function? But, you've got to begin to really pin your flag to a mast, and several flags to the mast around that benefit, and then begin to scan around the sort of the state of the art. One great indication that the benefit will outweigh the risk is there already a clinical protocol that suggests the use of your device or diagnostic? Because if there is, there's an indication the benefit is there. Is there something that it meets the specificity or the precision values or the linearity values of your IVD? Or is it that it meets the performance criteria for in terms of precision and accuracy of a diagnostic measurement, for example? If that's the case, you've got the benefit bit already. And now you have to think about the risk bit. And I always think about this as a little seesaw. You know, you go in the park and you sit with your friend across and you give it a seesaw, but nothing moves. You both sat there and it's not seesawing, because nothing moves if you haven't demonstrated you've got a high level of protection. So in any of the risk management work that you do, when you're trying to look at benefit over risk, the first thing you have to do is get to a situation where you ask yourself, have I achieved a high level of protection in my device? That is, have I applied all standards and best practices to reduce this risk as far as possible and maintain this high level of protection? And if you have yes, then the park attendant will come out, take the linchpin, and you can all start working out, well, is there a benefit and is there a risk? You know, and the daily life of your clinical evaluation report will be telling you, oh, there's a benefit. And the daily life of your risk management and post-market surveillance system might be going, oh, no, here comes another risk. You know, and you have to look at that sort of graduation. And probably the best way of explaining that is in terms of severities and likelihoods of occurrence, and moving it from likelihood of occurrence to occurrence. So if, for example, we said that we really want to reduce the risk of electric shock. So what we've done is we've designed the device so that it can withstand all sorts of bodily fluids and medications and cleaning agents. It can't get ingress into the device. We've gone IPX5 or whatever, you know, and we've designed that. It's not an elimination, but we've designed it to reduce as far as possible. And we verify through testing, and we find that even when we've got the jet wash on the damn thing, you know, for 10 hours, we've still not managed to penetrate any circuit, and we've got no moisture or anything like that. So happy days. But what we do begin to find is that the service centres are calling you back and they're saying, look, we're starting to see damage through corrosion that is through water ingress or through its humidity. And the only plausible thing we can see is that there's an occurrence that our design control is not working anymore. And what you've got there is this: we had this benefit risk ratio where the benefit was far outweighing the risk. There's the benefit, there's the risk. And what's happened now is that's happened. And we have to think about, well, what would the severity be? And the severity you guys said was that if it gets wet, it electrocutes. The harm is unacceptable. It's a 5 or whatever you want to score it, but it could actually, you know, it can kill a patient, can kill a user. And in that situation, that benefit risk ratio has just dropped to a point where it's not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And I think that in where there is a lack of that benefit risk ratio documented in clinical state of the art through common specifications, through MDCG guidance, through clinical guidance, NICE guidance, whatever it is that's out there where we can see that tangible, you know, this is what delivers benefit, this is what gives us quality of life years, blah, 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 blah. When there is a lack of that, you have to stress test the system and you have to almost simulate your risk management in terms of events. What would be the ones that would literally immediately say the benefit has been outweighed by the risk? We need to do something. And that could be just as simple as an occurrence of a report from any service centre around the world where you've got ingress. Because if that ingress can now cause electrocution, you've said it's unacceptable. So you better act that way, you know, and ultimately you can't go, well, we'll go with 3 deaths. 3 deaths is not, it's worse than 1 death, but it's not as bad as 5. You know, you don't want to be doing that. You want to stress test. Okay, so we've said in our risk analyses that the severity of this is this, the likelihood through all our design controls of that. So if we got market feedback that this happened, what would happen to our benefit risk ratio? Would it stay there and go, no, the benefit's still, look how heavy the benefit is, look how light the risk is? Or would it just go, you know, and do that with a number of the things already in your documented system and you should get a really good idea about what your tolerance is, and train anybody who's doing feedback or trending, or anybody in the business that is sort of evaluating that, to be that sensitive, because the regulators and product liability lawyers will jump all over that, rightly, to protect the patient.
So there's a spoiler alert there, is that we'll be talking about post-market surveillance in another webinar, but the outputs from the post-market surveillance clearly has a link in with updating your risk management, particularly if you're using your product in a new market, or if, as what you're doing when you first market your product, you're introducing it to more and more people, and therefore looking for events which might occur at the real sort of extremes of use, I guess.
Absolutely.
So brings us on to last question, and I guess this is one of those things that everybody sort of talks about. We were talking about it, I think, in one of the other modules on clinical, is, of course, well, if I've got a low risk product, a class 1 or a class 2A product, I don't really need to worry about risk management too much, do I? I can almost sort of put that to one side. That's a bit of a misnomer, I think.
Yeah, I think that the millions and millions of pounds and dollars that have been expended defending, paying out patients who have been injured by class 1 devices would say otherwise. The realities is that class 1 devices inherently should have safety characteristics that do not make a conformity assessment body, a notified body, have to get involved, or even a regulatory authority involved in scrutinizing, such as the well publicized state of the art. The class 1 products should literally, if you meet the GSPRs, then quite frankly, it should be a breeze, and because there are no inherent characteristics that made it a higher risk, there are no classification rules that have knocked it up to a 2A, or there are no conditions like sterile or measuring or reuse that have caused new risks that we're not happy with, then, you should feel that there are less uncertainties, but you should know that that's only reduced the likelihood of those uncertainties, of those risks appearing, if you meet the GSPRs. Mm-hmm. And the GSPRs have got 139 risks in them, and you've got to make sure that out of those 139, whichever ones are applicable because of the device type, the intended use, you nail it. We've got many instances where, products that are non-implantable, minimally invasive, non-invasive, invasive through natural orifices, for example, where they've got contaminated somehow and they've harmed, and that is still the same as if it was a class 3 implantable product or a class 1. It's irrelevant. The risk can still be unacceptable, and the harm can still be highly severe if that hazardous situation should occur. We see, active medical devices that are not therapeutic diagnostic software, that are other active devices, therapeutic with high energies or energies of concern. We've got those type of devices that will be class 1, but they've still got a battery in them. They've still got electric circuits. They still may have software, and they might get hacked. Data might get stolen. That's a harm. We might have erroneous results that affect thousands and thousands and thousands of patients. That's a public health risk and a harm. We might have electrical energies where we've got fire, we've got electrocutions, we've got contamination or poisoning, whatever it is. Those GSPRs are still applicable to class 1. The only reason class 1 and class 3 exists is because there are risks where the state of the art is more nuanced, and notified bodies or conformity assessment bodies have to be involved, who are competent to be able to evaluate to a higher degree that those GSPRs are being addressed.
Just as one last final point, I remember speaking to some colleagues in the MHRA once, and they said they had more vigilance cases on hospital beds than any other product, and there we have something which you wouldn't expect to have inherent risks built into them. But clearly, they're a product which needs that sort of management and assessment and moving forward. So,
yeah, we're seeing that with software, Phil. Now,
I bet
the big one is, these were typically class 1 devices. They're moving up to class 2A devices. The class 1 to 2A should have done nothing to what you did in terms of your design verification, your software validation, your integration testing, your threat modeling and cybersecurity, and your if it's got AI in it, your sort of selection of the appropriate tools and models and controls to ensure that it's doing what it's doing. But now it's a 2A. Quite frankly, the only difference is the notifiable bodies will be looking at what your solutions were and determining whether they were against the state of the art, but the risks still remained and, can still cause a myriad of different types of harms. Similarly with IVD products, those class A or non-list A and list B devices under the old IVDs, bloody hell, some of them were detecting cancer, they were or genetic testing for underlying conditions that the level of psychological harms you'd have if these tests were not accurate, but now you've been led to believe that you've got to have a double mastectomy is something that, I couldn't imagine, that their class, that they carry risks. And the classification system is not there to drive the necessity to address GSPRs. The GSPRs have to be applied across all device classes.
James, another fantastic, insightful and informative discussion. Thank you so much for your time. It's a fascinating area, risk, and it's got so many impacts in different areas of regulation. And I hope that our listeners and watchers of this webinar are beginning to sort of make those links between the different sections that we're doing on the regulations themselves. But thank you again for your time and your insight, and really look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Phil.